She thought it was just a small act of kindness. One umbrella, one rainy morning, nothing more. But when he showed up the next day, and the next, people began to wonder, why was a billionaire waiting in the rain for a single mom? "Mommy says you're my daddy." In one heartbeat, her life spiraled into scandal. A secret no one saw coming, a choice that could cost her everything. Was it fate, or a mistake too big to survive? And when the world turns against them, will love, faith, and one umbrella be enough? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning air bit through Grace's thin coat as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk, her fingers wrapped tightly around Leo's small hand. Chicago's November chill showed no mercy, especially not at this early hour when the sun was just a pale suggestion behind heavy clouds. "Mama, look! The clouds are crying," Leo said, pointing up at the gray sky with his free hand. His superhero backpack bounced against his shoulders with each step. Grace managed a smile despite her exhaustion. "Yes, mi amor. That's why we need to hurry." Her other arm cradled their only umbrella, the blue one she'd found on clearance last spring. The weather report had promised rain all week, and she couldn't afford to replace it if something happened to it. The wind picked up as they rounded the corner onto Maple Street. Leo's excitement grew as the bus stop came into view. He loved anything with wheels, but buses held a special place in his heart. "Number 42, comes in 6 minutes," he announced proudly, reciting the schedule he'd memorized weeks ago. Grace's shoes, worn thin at the soles, splashed through puddles as they approached the stop. The weak metal awning offered little protection from the strengthening drizzle, and already 3 people huddled beneath it. A young woman in scrubs checked her phone, an elderly man clutched his cane, and, somewhat out of place, a man in an expensive suit stood at the edge of the shelter. The rain began to fall harder, drums against the metal awning. Grace guided Leo toward the last dry spot, but the suited man stepped aside, gesturing to the space he'd vacated. "Please," he said, his voice gentle despite his formal appearance. "Take my spot." Grace hesitated, noting how his clothes were already soaked through. His dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his hands, she noticed them trembling, whether from cold or something else, she wasn't sure. "That's very kind, but you're already wet," Grace protested. "We couldn't." "I insist," he said, taking another step into the rain. Water dripped from his chin, and his briefcase looked expensive enough to feed her and Leo for a month. Leo tugged at her sleeve. "Mama?" His hands are shaking like when I forget my mittens. Grace looked down at her umbrella, then at Leo's concerned face. Her son's heart was always so quick to care for others, a trait she'd worked hard to nurture, even when their own circumstances were tight. The man's kindness, in offering them the dry spot, stirred something in her chest. Making a quick decision, Grace held out her umbrella to the stranger. "Here," she said firmly. "Please take it." The man's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't." "You're shivering," Grace interrupted, her voice carrying the same tone she used when telling Leo to put on his jacket. "And that suit probably costs more than my monthly rent. Please." He remained frozen, water streaming down his face. "But what about you?" Grace straightened her shoulders. "We'll be fine. Leo has his raincoat, and I'm heading to work anyway." She didn't mention that her uniform would be damp all day, or that she'd have to walk home in the rain later. Leo bounced on his toes, adding, "Yeah, and I love puddles." The sound of hydraulic brakes announced the arrival of Bus 42. Leo's face lit up at the familiar hiss of the doors opening. "Take it," Grace insisted, pressing the umbrella into the stranger's hands. "Pay it forward someday." The man's fingers closed around the handle automatically, his expression still stunned. Grace ushered Leo toward the bus, helping him up the steep steps. As they found their seats, she glanced back through the raindrop-streaked window. The suited man stood exactly where they'd left him, staring at the blue umbrella in his hands as if it were something precious and incomprehensible. The rain continued to run down his face, but he made no move to open it. He simply stood there, lost in thought, as the bus pulled away from the curb. Leo pressed his face to the window, watching the bus stop shrink into the distance. "Mama, why did you give him your umbrella?" Grace smoothed his damp hair back from his forehead. Because sometimes, mi amor, the right thing to do is to help someone else, even if it means getting a little wet yourself. But he was wearing a fancy suit, Leo said, his brow furrowed in concentration. Don't rich people have lots of umbrellas? Having money doesn't mean someone can't need kindness, Grace explained, thinking of the genuine surprise in the stranger's eyes. Sometimes, the people who look like they have everything are the ones who need a simple act of kindness the most. Leo nodded seriously, though she could tell he was still processing this idea. He pulled his bus route map from his backpack, tracing their journey with his finger as he did every morning. Bus 42 goes all the way across the city, he informed her, not for the first time. Maybe the man with your umbrella will ride it someday too. Maybe, Grace agreed, watching the city scroll past the window. The rain fell harder now, streaking the glass and turning the world outside into a blur of gray shapes and moving shadows. She thought of the umbrella she'd given away, her only one, and felt no regret, only a quiet warmth in her chest. Sometimes the smallest gestures created the biggest ripples, though she had no way of knowing where this one might lead. The bus continued its journey through the wet Chicago streets, carrying them toward another day of work and school, of struggle and small victories. Grace's coat would be damp by the time she reached the hotel, but she'd meant what she'd said about paying it forward. Some lessons were worth getting a little wet for. The next morning dawned just as gray as the day before, though the rain fell in a gentler pattern now, more of a persistent drizzle than yesterday's downpour. Grace clutched Leo's hand as they made their way down the familiar path to Maple 4th, her work uniform, already crisp beneath her coat. "Mama, my socks have puddles in them," Leo announced, splashing through another shallow pool on the sidewalk with the unbridled joy only a 7-year-old could muster. "Mijo, please, try to stay dry. We don't want you catching a cold," Grace said, tugging him gently away from the edge of another forming puddle. Her own shoes weren't much better at keeping out the water, but she'd learned to ignore such discomforts long ago. As they rounded the corner to their bus stop, Grace stopped short. There, sitting on the metal bench under the aging awning, was the suited man from yesterday. His presence was somehow both unexpected and oddly fitting, like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The umbrella she'd given him lay folded across his lap, perfectly parallel to his knees. Leo, naturally, was the first to break the moment of surprise. "Look, Mama, it's the nice man from yesterday." His voice carried through the morning drizzle with unrestrained enthusiasm. The man looked up, and a warm smile spread across his face. He immediately stood, gesturing to the relatively dry bench he'd been occupying. "Good morning," he said simply, his voice carrying the same gentle authority it had held yesterday. Grace hesitated, studying him. His suit was different today, charcoal instead of navy, but just as well tailored. His shoes were polished, despite the weather, and his silver-streaked hair was neatly combed. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not at a bus stop in this working-class neighborhood. "Good morning," Grace replied carefully, her hand tightening slightly around Leo's. The man took a step back, giving them space to move past him to the bench. There was something both unsettling and touching about his presence, about the way he stood so quietly in the rain. Leo had no such reservations. He bounded forward, dragging Grace along with him, and plopped onto the bench. "Mama, look, the bench isn't wet at all. He saved it for us." Grace sat down beside her son, her weathered work bag settled on her lap. The stranger remained standing, raindrops darkening the shoulders of his expensive suit. The umbrella, her umbrella from yesterday, remained unopened across his lap. "Thank you," Grace said softly, not quite sure what she was thanking him for. For the dry bench? For being here? For the strange feeling of being watched over that she couldn't quite shake? He simply nodded, that same warm smile touching his eyes but never growing into anything more presumptuous. He didn't try to make small talk or ask questions. He just stood there, a quiet guardian in the morning drizzle. Leo filled the silence with his usual chatter, pointing out every bus that wasn't theirs and explaining to no one in particular how he could tell the difference. "See, the 157 has a blue stripe, but our bus has a green one, and the numbers are different sizes, and..." The familiar hiss of hydraulic brakes cut through Leo's bus tutorial. Their bus pulled up to the curb, its wipers beating a steady rhythm against the windshield. "That's us, Mijo," Grace said, standing and straightening Leo's jacket. As they moved toward the bus doors, she glanced back at the stranger. He hadn't moved, hadn't even opened the umbrella. He just stood there, watching them with that same gentle expression. Through the bus window, as they found their usual seats, Grace could see him still at the stop. The rain continued to fall, darkening his suit and running down his face, but the umbrella remained folded in his lap. He sat back down on the now empty bench, as if settling in for a long wait. The bus pulled away from the curb, and Grace watched through the rain-streaked window as the man's figure grew smaller and smaller, a solitary sentinel in the morning gray. Her chest felt tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Mama!" Leo's voice pulled her attention back inside the bus. "Why didn't the nice man use the umbrella?" Grace looked down at her son's curious face and ran a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know, mi amor," she said truthfully. "I don't know." Wednesday morning brought more of Chicago's signature drizzle. Grace and Leo stepped onto Maple Street, and there he was again, the suited stranger, perched on the same bench, her umbrella laid carefully across his lap, just like yesterday. And the day before. "Good morning," he said softly, the same gentle smile touching his lips as he shifted to make room. Grace nodded politely, but kept her distance, choosing to stand. Leo waved enthusiastically, and she gave his hand a gentle squeeze, a silent reminder to be friendly but careful, just as they'd discussed. "Look, Mommy, he has your umbrella," Leo pointed out, as if she might have missed it. "Yes, Mijo, I see." Grace's eyes met the stranger's for a brief moment. He ducked his head, almost shy, and focused on straightening his already straight tie. A familiar chortle drew Grace's attention. Mavis Green stood at the corner, her bright purple raincoat impossible to miss. The retired teacher had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood, and nothing escaped her notice. "Well, well," Mavis Stage whispered, loud enough for half the block to hear. "Looks like our bus stop has a new regular." She winked at Grace, clearly amused by the situation. Grace felt her cheeks warm despite the cool morning air. The man didn't react to Mavis's commentary, just sat there with perfect posture, occasionally checking his expensive watch. A paper coffee cup steamed beside him, untouched. Thursday was the same, and Friday? Each morning he arrived before them, always in pristine suits despite the weather, always with that umbrella, always waiting. 3 days now, Mavis commented on Friday morning, sidling up to Grace while Leo studied a puddle's reflection. "That's some dedication for a thank you." "I didn't ask for this," Grace murmured, watching the stranger from the corner of her eye. He seemed absorbed in his phone, but his fingers weren't moving across the screen. "Course you didn't, honey." Mavis adjusted her rain hat. "But you gave up your only umbrella to a complete stranger. People don't see that kind of kindness every day. Makes an impression." Grace shifted uncomfortably. "It wasn't anything special. Just—" She trailed off, remembering how his hands had trembled in the cold. "Just being decent?" Mavis finished. "That's exactly what makes it special." She patted Grace's arm. "Though I must say, he's awful well dressed, for someone who needs to ride the bus." The bus rounded the corner, and Leo bounced on his toes. "It's number 42 today," he announced with delight. "That means Mr. Rodriguez is driving." As they boarded, Grace glanced back. The stranger raised his hand in a small wave, and something about the gesture made her throat tight. He looked lonely, somehow. Important suit, expensive watch, but sitting in the rain day after day just to return an umbrella? The mystery followed her to work. Grace swiped her time card exactly 7 minutes early, as always, but Mr. Harrell still materialized from his office like a disapproving ghost. "Clock in is at 7 sharp, Miss Delgado," he said, voice dripping with his usual condescension. "Not 6:53. "Yes, Mr. Harrell." Grace kept her tone neutral as she began preparing her cleaning cart. 7 years of experience had taught her which battles were worth fighting. She methodically checked her supplies: fresh towels, sanitizer, mini soaps. The familiar routine usually centered her, but today her thoughts kept drifting back to Maple, 4th. To that umbrella laid across a suited stranger's lap like an offering. To the coffee he never drank and the way he looked, both determined and unsure. The cartwheels squeaked as she pushed it toward the service elevator. Grace had learned long ago that questioning life's strange turns rarely led anywhere useful. Better to focus on what she could control, doing her job well, keeping Leo safe, making sure they had enough for bus fare and groceries. Still, as she pressed the elevator button, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow morning would bring. Would he be there again? This quiet man who waited in the rain? And why did the thought make her feel both uneasy and oddly warm? The elevator doors opened with a tired ding. Grace squared her shoulders and pushed her cart inside, pushing thoughts of umbrellas and strangers aside. She had rooms to clean, and questions wouldn't pay the bills. But later, as she wiped down counters and straightened beds, she found herself humming something she hadn't done at work in a long time. Maybe Mavis was right. Maybe kindness did leave an impression, not just on those who received it, but on those who gave it too. The crystal glasses clinked softly as Grace polished them one by one, her movements practiced and efficient. Early morning light filtered through the hotel ballroom's tall windows, catching on the pristine silverware she'd arranged at each place setting. The massive chandeliers cast sparkles across the white tablecloths, making the room feel almost magical, though Grace knew better than to get caught up in the glamour. She was here to work, not daydream. 20 minutes until the donors arrive, Mr. Harrell announced, striding through the double doors. His shoes clicked against the marble floor as he inspected her work with his usual scowl. Everything must be perfect for Mr. Whitaker's speech. Grace nodded, keeping her head down as she moved to the next table. She'd learned long ago that staying quiet and invisible made her shifts easier. The morning rush at the bus stop had left her arms aching, but she couldn't afford to slow down now. A commotion near the entrance caught her attention. Several men in expensive suits filed in, followed by hotel management, fawning over someone she couldn't quite see. Grace kept working, used to the parade of wealthy visitors who passed through these halls without sparing her a glance. "If we could have Mr. Whitaker test the microphone," a technician called out, Grace's hand stilled on the glass she was polishing. That voice, she knew that voice. Slowly she lifted her gaze to the dais at the front of the room. The umbrella man stood at the podium, adjusting his tie. The glass nearly slipped from her fingers. Grace caught it just in time, her heart thundering against her ribs. It was him, the same gentle eyes, the same careful way he held himself. But instead of sitting quietly on a wet bench, he wore an impeccable suit and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to commanding rooms like this. "Testing, 1, 2, he spoke into the microphone, and several hotel staff nodded approvingly. Grace tried to make herself smaller behind the table settings, praying he wouldn't notice her. But as he glanced around the room, their eyes met across the glittering expanse. She saw the flash of recognition cross his face, watched his lips part slightly in surprise. "Miss Delgado," Mr. Harrell's sharp voice made her jump. "The water pitchers still need filling." Grace hurried to the service station, grateful for the excuse to escape. Her mind raced as she filled crystal pitchers with ice water. The quiet man from her bus stop was Daniel Whitaker, the billionaire philanthropist whose name she'd seen in the newspaper just last week. He'd been sitting in the rain for days, waiting with an umbrella she'd practically forced on him. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. No wonder he'd seemed so startled by her small gesture. A man like that probably had people carrying umbrellas for him everywhere he went. The next hour passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and the controlled chaos of wealthy donors filing in. Grace kept to the shadows, refilling water glasses and clearing empty plates with practiced efficiency. But she could feel his presence, sense his gaze finding her occasionally as he gave his speech about community investment and the importance of seeing the humanity in every person. When the lunch ended and the crowd began to thin, Grace started gathering dishes as quickly as she could, but she wasn't fast enough. "Excuse me," his familiar voice said behind her. Grace turned slowly, clutching a stack of plates to her chest like a shield. Up close, Daniel Whitaker looked both exactly like and nothing like the man she'd met in the rain. His suit was perfectly tailored now, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes held the same quiet warmth she remembered. "I still have something of yours," he said softly, as though they were still at that humble bus stop instead of standing in this opulent ballroom. Grace shook her head, managing to whisper, "Keep it." She didn't want him to think she regretted her small kindness, even if she now felt foolish for offering charity to a billionaire. But Daniel stepped closer, his expression earnest. "I'll be at that stop until you let me give it back." The sincerity in his voice made her pause. Here was one of the city's most powerful men, promising to sit on a wet bench every morning just to return a $5 umbrella. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh, but something in his eyes told her this was about more than just the umbrella. "Mr. Whitaker," a woman in a sharp business suit called from across the room. "The foundation board is waiting." "One moment," he replied, not taking his eyes off Grace. "Please," he added quietly, "just for her. Let me do this properly." Before Grace could respond, Mr. Harrell appeared at her elbow. "Miss Delgado, the kitchen needs those dishes." She nodded quickly, dropping into a slight bow that felt ridiculous the moment she did it. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitaker." As she hurried away, she could still feel his gaze following her. The weight of the dishes in her arms felt nothing compared to the weight of knowing that tomorrow morning one of Chicago's wealthiest men would be waiting at her bus stop, holding an umbrella she'd given him in the rain. The afternoon sun streamed through the hotel's grand windows, warming the polished marble floors of the lobby. Grace hurried through the revolving doors, with Leo's small hand clasped in hers, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he skipped to keep up with her quick pace. "Remember what I said about being extra quiet, my Joe?" Grace whispered, smoothing his unruly dark curls. "Mama just needs to grab her cleaning cart, then we'll head straight home." Leo nodded solemnly, though his eyes were already wandering to take in the lobby's gleaming chandeliers and plush furniture. "Like a library mouse?" he whispered back, making Grace smile despite her exhaustion. They turned down the service corridor, but Leo tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, look! The pretty room from this morning!" The ballroom doors stood partially open, voices and the clink of glasses drifting out. The donor luncheon was still in full swing, the room now filled with well-dressed figures mingling around elegant table settings. Grace meant to hurry past, but Leo's grip suddenly slipped from hers. "Leo, wait," she called, but he was already darting through the doors, drawn by the sparkle and sound like a moth to flame. Grace's heart leaped into her throat as she followed him into the crowded room. Phones were out, recording snippets of casual conversation and the remnants of what had clearly been an important event. And there, in the center of it all, stood Daniel Whitaker, the man from the bus stop, surrounded by admirers, but somehow looking just as isolated as he had in the rain. Before Grace could reach him, Leo had already woven through the forest of legs and designer suits. He walked right up to Daniel with the pure confidence of childhood, tugging at his sleeve to get his attention. Daniel turned, his expression softening as he looked down at Leo. Several phones swiveled to capture the moment the billionaire philanthropist engaging with a child. Grace pushed forward desperately, but she was too far away. Leo's clear voice carried in the sudden quiet. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The silence that followed was absolute. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Daniel's face went completely still, color draining from his cheeks as he stared down at Leo in shock. Grace felt the world tilt sideways. Her mind raced back to their bedtime prayers just days ago, when Leo had asked why some kids had daddies and others didn't. She'd tried to explain about God being a father to everyone, about good men who stood watch in storms like fathers should, just like the kind stranger at the bus stop had done. But Leo, with his literal mind, had taken her words and twisted them into this moment of innocent misunderstanding that was now being captured on dozens of phones. The whispers started at the edges of the room, spreading like ripples in a pond. Grace saw several staff members exchange meaningful looks. A woman, in an expensive suit, was already typing rapidly on her phone, while others huddled in small groups, heads bent together. "Oh my God, did you hear what that kid just said? Isn't that one of the maids? Someone's recording this, right?" Daniel remained frozen, his usually composed face a mask of confusion and surprise. His mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. His eyes found Grace's across the room, filled with questions she couldn't begin to answer. Leo, oblivious to the chaos he'd created, simply smiled up at Daniel with complete trust. "You wait for us every morning," he added helpfully, his voice still carrying in the hushed room. "Just like Mama said a daddy would." More phones appeared, more whispers circulated. Grace finally reached them, her legs feeling like lead. She gently took Leo's hand, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitaker." He misunderstood, but the damage was already done. She could hear the buzz of messages being sent, could practically see the video clips spreading across social media. The story was already forming, and no amount of explanation would stop it now. A sleek woman in a tailored blazer appeared at Daniel's side, touching his elbow. "Daniel, we should discuss this in private." Her sharp eyes assessed Grace and Leo with calculated concern. Grace pulled Leo closer, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. Her uniform marked her clearly as hotel staff, and she could already see Mr. Harrell pushing through the crowd, his face thunderous. The peaceful morning at the bus stop felt like a lifetime ago. Now the simple gift of an umbrella had somehow led to this moment where a child's innocent misunderstanding threatened to become something much more complicated. Leo tugged at her sleeve, finally sensing the tension in the air. "Mama? Did I say something wrong?" Grace squeezed his hand, trying to shield him from the increasingly hostile atmosphere. The ballroom that had seemed so magical earlier now felt like a trap, with every phone pointed their way like weapons and every whispered conversation another judgment. Daniel still hadn't moved or spoken, his usual confidence replaced by a deer-in-headlights stillness that matched Grace's own paralysis. The only sound was the steady murmur of gossip spreading through the room like wildfire, growing louder with each passing second. The elegant space that had sparkled with promise just hours ago now hummed with speculation and scandal, all because of a little boy's whispered words and a simple misunderstanding about faith, fathers, and the man who waited in the rain. Grace led Leo to a quiet corner of the service corridor, away from the bustling kitchen staff and the echoes of the ballroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she knelt to his eye level, but she kept her voice gentle and steady. "Mijo, remember last week when we talked about how God watches over us like a father?" She brushed a curl from his forehead. "And how sometimes he sends kind people to help us, like when it's raining." Leo's brown eyes widened with understanding, then clouded with confusion. "But you said the nice man at the bus stop was like that too, standing in the rain to help people, like fathers should." "Oh, sweetie." Grace pulled him close, his small frame fitting perfectly against her shoulder. "I meant that his kindness reminded us of God's love. Mr. Whitaker isn't your daddy, he's just a good person who helped us one morning." Leo's lower lip quivered. "Did I do something wrong, Mama?" "No, mi amor. You just got a little mixed up, that's all." She hugged him tighter, breathing in the familiar scent of his school day shampoo. "Sometimes grown-ups misunderstand things too." The corridor lights flickered overhead as Grace helped Leo with his backpack. She managed to retrieve her cleaning cart and clock out without running into anyone from the ballroom, thankful for the back exit she knew so well. On the bus ride home, Leo dozed against her arm while Grace's phone began to vibrate. She ignored it at first, focusing on the gentle weight of her son's head and the passing city lights. But when they reached their stop, the notifications wouldn't stop. Inside their small apartment, after Leo was settled with his homework and a warm bowl of soup, Grace finally looked at her phone. Her stomach dropped. 27 text messages, 15 missed calls. Maria from housekeeping had sent, "OMG Grace, have you seen this?" followed by a link. Another message from Josue in maintenance. "It's all over Twitter. You okay?" With shaking fingers, Grace opened the link. There it was, a shaky phone video from the ballroom. Leo's innocent face turned up to Daniel Whitaker, his whispered words somehow crystal clear in the recording. "Mommy says you're my daddy." The clip cut to Daniel's stunned expression, then to Grace's moment of horror. Comments were already flooding in. "Billionaire's secret love child? Poor kid, just exposed the truth. Who is this maid?" Grace's vision blurred. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and gripped the edge of the sink, forcing herself to take deep breaths. Through the small window above the dishes, she could see the glow of the city, the same lights that had always seemed so full of possibility. Now they felt like spotlights, searching. Her phone buzzed again. Mr. Harrell's name appeared on the screen. "Ms. Delgado, we need to discuss this situation first thing tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. sharp. This is a serious matter concerning the hotel's reputation." Grace knew that tone. It was the same one he used when writing up Maria for speaking Spanish to guests, or when he'd rejected Josue's request for time off to attend his daughter's quinceañera. Always so polite on the surface, but with something harder underneath. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Mr. Whitaker's representatives would like to schedule a meeting to address this sensitive matter. Leo's voice drifted from the living room. "Mama, can you help me with my math?" "Just a minute, my amor." Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt. She watched Leo from the kitchen doorway, his face scrunched in concentration over his workbook, pencil gripped carefully in his small fingers. He was everything good and pure in her world. The thought of him becoming fodder for gossip sites and cruel comments made her chest ache. More notifications lit up her phone. Grace opened a drawer and buried the device beneath a stack of dish towels. The buzzing continued, muffled but persistent, like angry bees in a jar. Later, after Leo was bathed and tucked into bed, Grace knelt beside him in the dim glow of his nightlight. His breathing had already settled into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. She smoothed his blanket and pressed a kiss to his forehead, breathing a quiet prayer. "Señor, give me strength. Protect my boy. Show me the way through this storm." She lingered there, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest, memorizing the innocent curve of his cheek against the pillow. Whatever came tomorrow, this moment, this peace, was real. This was what mattered. "Te amo, mi corazón," she whispered, then rose quietly and slipped from the room. In the kitchen, the phone buzzed once more from its hiding place. Grace left it there, buried under cotton and silence. Instead, she filled a cup with tea and moved to the apartment's small window seat, her favorite spot for finding clarity. The city stretched before her, a tapestry of lights and shadows. Somewhere out there was a bus stop where kindness had sparked a moment that now threatened everything she'd built. But as she sipped her tea and watched the world below, Grace felt something solid settle in her chest. She'd faced harder storms than this. She would face this one too, with dignity and truth. For tonight, though, she would simply be a mother watching over her sleeping child, gathering strength for whatever morning might bring. The morning air bit sharper than usual as Grace and Leo approached Maple 2, 4th. The familiar sight of Daniel on the bench, umbrella laid across his lap, almost made Grace smile until she noticed the two men in dark suits standing beside him. Their polished shoes and stern expressions seemed out of place among the regular morning crowd of factory workers and students. Leo bounced on his toes, pointing at a city bus rumbling past. "Look, Mommy, that's Route 37. It goes all the way to—" "Not now, mijo." Grace squeezed his hand, her stomach knotting as one of the suits, a man with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Miss Delgado?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Richard Morton, Chief Counsel for the Whitaker Foundation. This is my associate, Mr. Chen. We'd like a moment of your time." Grace checked her watch. "Leo's bus comes in 8 minutes. This won't take long." Morton gestured to a spot away from the other waiting passengers. "Please?" Daniel hadn't moved from the bench. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the wet pavement, hands clasped around the folded umbrella like it was keeping him anchored. Grace led Leo to the bench. "Stay with Mr. Whitaker for a minute, okay? I can see you from right over there." She turned to Daniel. "If that's all right?" He nodded, finally meeting her eyes. Something in his expression made her chest tighten, a mixture of apology and resignation. The lawyers guided her several steps away, opening sleek leather portfolios. Mr. Chen produced a document while Morton cleared his throat. "Ms. Delgado, we understand yesterday's incident was likely a simple misunderstanding. However, given Mr. Whitaker's position and the sensitive nature of the Foundation's work, we need to address this quickly and quietly. Grace wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her uniform jacket felt. Address what, exactly? The video clip is gaining traction online. Morton's voice dropped lower. We're prepared to offer you a very generous settlement package. $50,000. With the possibility of additional education funds for your son. The amount made Grace's head spin more money than she'd make in 2 years. But then Morton slid the paper forward, and she caught phrases like mutual non-disclosure and morality clause. In exchange, he continued, you'll agree not to discuss Mr. Whitaker or yesterday's events with anyone. No social media, no press. You'll also need to find employment elsewhere, preferably outside the hotel industry. We can assist with job placement in a different sector. Blood rushed in Grace's ears. She looked back at the bench where Leo was chattering happily to Daniel about bus routes. Daniel's shoulders were rigid, his knuckles white around the umbrella handle. You want to pay me to disappear. The words tasted bitter. And if I don't? Mr. Chen spoke for the first time, his tone carefully neutral. The hotel chain values its relationship with the Whitaker Foundation. They're unlikely to risk that over. Well, over a maid? Grace finished for him. Morton shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Delgado, please understand this offer is quite generous. It would give you and your son a fresh start, away from any potential complications. Grace thought of her mother, who'd cleaned houses for 40 years, without bowing her head to anyone. Who'd taught Grace that dignity wasn't something you could buy or sell. No. She handed the papers back. I won't take hush money. Ms. Delgado, my son made an honest mistake. He's 7 years old and confused a bedtime story about faith with kindness from a stranger. That's all. She straightened her spine. I won't pretend we did something wrong by existing in the same space as Mr. Whitaker. Morton's practiced smile tightened. Consider your position carefully. Single mothers often face extra scrutiny in custody arrangements. Social media storms can be unpredictable. The threat, however veiled, made Grace's hands shake, but not with fear, with anger. Are you done? She didn't wait for an answer, turning back toward the bench. Leo, time for your bus. The yellow school bus was already pulling up. Leo gave Daniel an enthusiastic wave before taking Grace's hand. She helped him up the steps, managed to smile for the driver, then watched until the bus turned the corner. When she looked back, Morton and Chen were already walking away, speaking in low voices into their phones. Daniel remained on the bench, the same conflicted expression etched on his face. For a moment, their eyes met across the morning crowd. Grace lifted her chin and walked away, her steps quick and measured. She had a shift to get to, rooms to clean, and her own dignity to keep intact. The sound of traffic and wind almost drowned out the quiet voice in her head, wondering if she'd just cost herself everything. Grace's hands trembled as she organized the cleaning supplies on her cart. The morning's confrontation with Daniel's lawyers still echoed in her mind. The squeak of her cart's wheels against the polished hotel floor seemed louder than usual as she pushed it down the empty hallway. Ms. Delgado, Mr. Harrell's crisp voice made her freeze. My office. Now. The hotel manager's office was a testament to precision. Every pen on his desk stood at attention, and the awards on his wall hung perfectly level. Mr. Harrell sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Close the door, he instructed, his tone carrying the artificial sweetness she'd learned to dread. Grace's uniform suddenly felt too tight as she perched on the edge of the visitor's chair. The morning light filtering through the Venetian blinds cast prison bar shadows across the carpet. Miss Delgado, I've always appreciated your adequate work ethic. Mr. 70 P.S. Harrell adjusted his gold cufflinks. But this recent situation is deeply concerning. Have you seen social media today? He swiveled his computer monitor toward her. The video of Leo's innocent whisper to Daniel played on repeat. Mommy says you're my daddy. Grace's chest tightened. Our guests expect discretion and refinement. Mr. Harrell's mouth twisted into a thin line. Not tabloid drama from the cleaning staff. This kind of behavior, well, it's what people might expect from your Background. But the Grand Palmer has standards. Heat rose in Grace's cheeks. Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. My son simply— I don't need the details. He held up one manicured hand. What I need is for this situation to disappear. Mr. Whitaker is an important client. His foundation books multiple events here annually. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your kind of drama could cost us hundreds of thousands in revenue. Your kind. The words stung like a slap. Grace straightened her spine, thinking of her mother's quiet dignity in the face of similar jabs. I've worked here 5 years without complaint, she said steadily. I've covered extra shifts, stayed late. And we've been very generous, overlooking certain irregularities in your documentation. The threat hung in the air between them. Grace's hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. Now, Mr. Harrell continued, I suggest you handle this situation quickly. Perhaps accept whatever arrangement Mr. Whitaker's people have offered? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Otherwise, we may need to review your position here. Times are tight after all. Grace stood, her legs shaking but her voice firm. Is that all, Mr. Harrell? For now. He turned back to his computer. Close the door on your way out. In the service corridor, Grace leaned against the wall, breathing deeply. A text message buzzed on her phone, her sister Carmen. You're on Channel 5. Grace ducked into the break room, where the ancient TV mounted in the corner was already playing the news. Her coworkers clustered around it, falling silent as she entered. On screen, a polished anchor gestured to Daniel's photo. Sources close to billionaire Daniel Whitaker remained tight-lipped about allegations of a secret love child. The viral video, filmed at yesterday's charity luncheon, shows what appears to be— the screen split to show Leo's innocent face, his whispered words now broadcast across Chicago. Grace's throat closed up. What would this do to her sweet, bus-loving boy? Would other children tease him? Would teachers treat him differently? Her phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. Another reporter? Or worse, someone from Child Protective Services. She'd heard stories of custody challenges sparked by less. Girl? Maria, one of the older maids, touched her arm. You okay? Grace managed a nod, but her mind raced. Her entire life balanced on the edge of this moment, her job, her reputation, Leo's stability. All because of one misunderstood prayer about God being a father to the fatherless. The afternoon dragged by in a blur of cleaned rooms and avoided glances. When her shift finally ended, Grace waited until the other maids had left before slipping out the service entrance. The setting sun painted Chicago's buildings in shades of amber and shadow. As she walked past Maple, 4th, movement caught her eye. There, still sitting on the bench where she'd left him that morning, was Daniel. His expensive suit was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. The umbrella, her umbrella, lay unused across his knees. Their eyes met across the evening traffic. In his, she saw the same haunted uncertainty she felt. He made no move to approach her, but his presence spoke volumes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Grace hurried past, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. She needed to pick up Leo from after-school care, needed to figure out how to protect him from the storm that was building. Behind her, Daniel remained on the bench, a lonely figure in the gathering dusk, while overhead, news helicopters circled like vultures waiting to feast on their story. The weight of it all pressed down on her shoulders. Mr. Harrell's threats, the media circus, the lawyer's offers, and Daniel's silent vigil. Her job hung by a thread. Her son's peace was shattered, and a billionaire's reputation teetered on the edge because of a child's innocent whisper. As she walked away from Maple, 4th, Grace felt the full force of what they were all facing. A battle not just for truth, but for dignity, security, and the right to live without judgment. The rain began to fall harder, but she didn't look back. She couldn't afford to, not with so much at stake. The next morning painted Maple, 4th, in gentle strokes of dawn light. Grace clutched Leo's hand as they approached the bus stop, her breath visible in the cold air. Daniel sat in his usual spot, but something was different. 2 paper cups steamed beside him, and his suit jacket was draped over the bench's wet surface. "Good morning," Daniel said, his voice softer than usual. He picked up the cups and stood. "I brought coffee and hot chocolate." He glanced at Leo with a small smile. Grace hesitated. After yesterday's confrontation with the lawyers, she hadn't expected this. Leo tugged at her sleeve, eyeing the hot chocolate. "It's okay, sweetheart," she told Leo, accepting both cups from Daniel. She passed the hot chocolate to her son, who beamed. "Thank you, Mr. Daniel," Leo chirped, warming his hands around the cup. Daniel cleared his throat. "Could we talk, just for a few minutes?" He gestured to the bench where his jacket still lay. "I promise, no lawyers this time." Grace checked her watch. They had 10 minutes until Leo's bus arrived. She nodded, and they sat down, Leo between them, happily sipping his treat. "I was wrong yesterday," Daniel said, his eyes fixed on the passing traffic. "I let others make decisions I should have made myself." He turned to face her. "What would help look like to you, Grace?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that before. Not the hotel management, not social services, not even well-meaning friends. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Have you noticed how many people wait here every morning? In all weather?" She pointed to the inadequate shelter, its plastic walls scratched and clouded. "Elderly folks like Mrs. Chen can barely stand for 20 minutes. When it rains, families crowd under this tiny roof." Daniel listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "The shelters need work, not just here," Grace continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "All along Route 23. Some stops don't even have benches anymore." Leo piped up. "Jimmy's grandma has to sit on her rolling cart at her stop." Daniel pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Tell me more." Grace described the daily struggles she witnessed. Mothers juggling strollers and umbrellas, students huddling together in winter, workers trying to keep their uniforms dry before shifts. "What if we fixed it?" Daniel suggested. "Not just the shelters, but really made them work for the community?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "A partnership," Daniel explained, writing as he talked. "The foundation provides funding, but locals decide what's needed. Heated benches maybe, better lighting, book exchanges." He looked up. "You know this community, Grace. These are your neighbors." "And who would run this project?" she asked cautiously. "The people who use these stops every day. We'd need a coordinator, though, someone who understands both the needs and the logistics." His eyes met hers meaningfully. Grace's mind raced. Was he offering her a job? Before she could ask, Leo's bus appeared at the corner. "Time to go, Maijo," she said, helping him gather his belongings. Leo carefully placed his empty cup in a nearby trash bin. "Think about it?" Daniel asked as they stood. "No pressure, no lawyers, just a chance to make things better." Grace watched Leo board his bus, waving until he found his seat. When she turned back to Daniel, she found herself studying him with new eyes. Gone was the awkward stranger from the first day, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely eager to help. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But I need time. And everything has to be transparent." Daniel nodded. "Of course. I'll be here tomorrow. Same time. With coffee," he added with a slight smile. Grace adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Why are you really doing this?" "Because you showed me kindness when I was just a wet stranger on a bench," he replied simply. "And because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to explain to a board of directors." A small laugh escaped her, the first real laugh she'd shared with him. "I have to get to work." "I'll wait," he said, settling back on the bench. "Take all the time you need." As Grace walked away, her steps felt lighter than they had in days. She glanced back once to see Daniel still seated at the bench, his face turned toward the rising sun. The morning light caught the metal frame of the old bus shelter, and for a moment she could almost see what it could become. Not just a place to wait, but a space where community could grow. The coffee in her hand was still warm, and for the first time since Leo's innocent words had sparked chaos, Grace felt something close to hope. Not certainty, not trust yet, but possibility. As bright and gentle as the dawn spreading across the Chicago sky. The worn wooden floors of St. Lydia's Fellowship Hall creaked under Grace's feet as she led Daniel through the doorway. The familiar scent of coffee, and old hymnals filled the air. Afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the long folding tables where several community members sat waiting. Pastor Joe stood from his chair, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he extended his hand. "Welcome to St. Lydia's, Mr. Whitaker. I'm Pastor Joe Williams. Please, call me Daniel," he replied, shaking the pastor's hand. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he took in the humble warmth of the room. Leo darted past them to claim his favorite spot at the kids' craft table in the corner, already pulling crayons from his backpack. Grace watched as Daniel's eyes followed her son, a hint of wonder crossing his face. "These are some of our most dedicated volunteers," Grace said, gesturing to the familiar faces around the table. "Mavis from the book club, Tom, who drives the senior shuttle, and Maria, who runs our food pantry." Mavis adjusted her thick glasses with a knowing smile. "So you're the famous umbrella man we've been hearing about." A flush crept up Daniel's neck. "I suppose I am." Pastor Joe pulled out chairs for both of them. "Grace tells me you want to help improve our bus stops. We've been praying for something like this for years." "The current shelters aren't enough," Daniel said, reaching into his briefcase. He spread out several photographs on the table, images of rain-soaked benches, cracked plastic, and dim lighting. "But I don't want to just throw money at the problem. I want to do this right, with the community's input." Maria leaned forward. "The shelter at Oak Street floods every time it rains. My granddaughter's shoes are always soaked by the time she gets to school. And the lighting's so poor at dusk," Tom added. "I've seen elderly folks struggling to read the bus schedules." Grace watched as Daniel took careful notes, his pen moving quickly across a leather-bound notebook. His usual corporate polish had softened here among the coffee cups and church fans. "What about books?" Leo's voice piped up from the craft table. He hurried over with a piece of paper clutched in his hands. "My bus house has a library." "Your bus house?" Daniel asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Leo proudly held up his crayon drawing. It showed a colorful structure with a pitched roof, windows, and what appeared to be shelves of books along one wall. "For waiting people to read stories." Daniel's face transformed as he studied the drawing. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside him. Rich, surprised, and utterly genuine. The sound filled the fellowship hall, and Grace realized she'd never heard him laugh before. The joy in it caught her off guard. "That's brilliant, Leo," Daniel said, wiping his eyes. "Would you mind if I kept this? It might help us design the real ones." Leo beamed and ran back to make more drawings. Pastor Joe smiled warmly at Daniel. "That's the first time I've seen you really laugh since we met." Daniel paused, looking somewhat startled himself. "I can't remember the last time I did." The group spent the next hour sketching ideas and sharing stories. Mavis suggested weatherproof book boxes. Tom recommended better seating for elderly riders. Maria spoke about the need for proper drainage and non-slip surfaces. Daniel's notebook filled with details, heated benches for winter, solar-powered USB charging stations, clear panels to block wind while maintaining visibility. But more than the practical suggestions, Grace noticed how he listened, really listened, to each person's experiences. "The key is maintenance," Grace added. "These improvements need to last. That's why we'll hire local people to manage them," Daniel replied. "Create jobs, build ownership. The community knows best what it needs." Pastor Joe nodded approvingly. "When we lift each other up, we all rise." As the meeting wound down, Leo proudly presented Daniel with 3 more drawings. Each bus house was more elaborate than the last, featuring everything from flower boxes to what looked like a slide. "The creativity in this room," Daniel marveled, carefully storing the drawings in his briefcase. "I've sat through $1,000 consulting sessions that didn't generate half as many good ideas." Later that night, after tucking Leo into bed, Grace stood in his dimly lit room. More bus shelter drawings covered one wall, a growing gallery of her son's imagination. Some showed families sheltering from rain, others depicted children reading books while they waited. In one, a figure in a suit sat on a bench, holding what was unmistakably an umbrella. She touched the corner of the nearest drawing, remembering Daniel's laugh in the fellowship hall. It had transformed him from the solemn stranger at the bus stop into someone real. Someone who could be touched by a child's simple vision of making the world better. The drawing seemed to glow in the soft light from Leo's night lamp. Each crayon stroke held the pure hope of a 7-year-old who believed in better things. Grace felt that hope, stirring in her own heart too, tentative but growing, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. Grace's fingers trembled as she read the revised schedule Mr. Harrell had just handed her. The stark black text showed all her daytime shifts replaced with midnight to 8 a.m. rotations. Her stomach dropped as she calculated how this would affect Leo's morning routine. "Is there a problem, Miss Delgado?" Mr. Harrell's voice dripped with fake concern. He stood behind his polished desk, hands clasped, wearing what she'd come to think of as his policy smile. "Sir, I've worked day shifts for 3 years. My son—" "We must be fair to all employees," he cut in smoothly. "Some of our staff have mentioned feeling overlooked for premium day shifts. I'm sure you understand." Grace's jaw tightened. She understood perfectly. This was punishment, wrapped in hotel policy. "Which staff members requested changes?" "That's confidential information." He adjusted his gold cufflinks. "The new schedule begins Monday, that's all." Outside his office, Grace leaned against the wall, schedule clutched to her chest. Maria, her friend from housekeeping, hurried over. "¿Qué pasó?" Maria whispered, dark eyes worried. "Midnight shifts," Grace managed. "All of them." "Qué injusto." Maria grabbed the schedule, scanning it in disbelief. "He's never switched anyone without notice before. This is because of the video, isn't it?" Grace nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "I'll figure something out, I have to. My sister might be able to watch Leo at night," Maria offered. "She works days at the grocery." Before Grace could respond, a commotion from the hotel's prestigious Azure dining room caught their attention. The breakfast meeting between Daniel and Edwin Porter, one of Chicago's wealthiest developers, was apparently over, and not quietly. "This is absurd, Daniel." Porter's voice carried through the elegant double doors. "You're throwing away a decade of partnership over some maid?" Grace and Maria exchanged glances. Several other staff members had stopped to listen. "That some maid has a name." Daniel's voice was controlled but firm. "And more integrity than anyone in this room. She's beneath you. Look at the scandal she's causing. My foundation can't be associated with this mess. Think about what you're risking." "I am thinking about it, Edwin." Daniel's voice grew clearer as the doors opened. He stood in the doorway, Porter red-faced behind him. "I'm thinking about what message it sends when we value money over human dignity. Keep your donation. We're done here." Porter stormed past them toward the lobby, nearly knocking over a cleaning cart. Daniel remained in the doorway, looking drained but resolute. His eyes met Grace's for a brief moment before he turned to speak quietly with his assistant. Grace slipped away to the service elevator, Maria following. As they descended to the basement level, Maria squeezed her arm. "Girl, did you hear that?" Maria's eyes were wide. "He just turned down Porter's money. That's got to be millions." "He shouldn't have done that," Grace whispered. "Not for me." The elevator doors opened to reveal Carmen from the kitchen, practically bouncing with excitement. "Did you hear? Porter threatened to pull all his hotel contracts too, but Mr. Whitaker didn't back down. He said if Porter wanted to punish working people to prove a point, he'd build new shelters in front of every property Porter owns." Grace's hands shook as she organized her cleaning supplies. The weight of what Daniel had done, what he'd sacrificed, settled heavy on her shoulders. She was grateful, deeply moved by his defense of her dignity. But fear gnawed at her heart. How many more powerful enemies would he make? How much would this protection cost him? "You okay, Mama?" Maria asked softly. "I don't know," Grace admitted. "I never wanted any of this. I just gave him an umbrella." "Sometimes the smallest kindness starts the biggest changes," Carmen said, patting Grace's shoulder. "That man up there? He's not defending you because he has to. He's doing it because you showed him how." Grace thought of Daniel sitting faithfully at the bus stop, of Leo's shelter drawings spread across the St. Lydia's tables, of the quiet way Daniel had asked what help looked like, instead of assuming he knew. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. The basement intercom crackled. "Housekeeping to Azure Room," Mr. Harrell's voice announced. Immediately. Grace squared her shoulders, grabbed her cart, and headed for the service elevator. She had midnight shifts to prepare for, a son to arrange care for, and a defender upstairs who'd just proved money wasn't everything. One step at a time, she told herself. One step at a time. The December afternoon glowed with possibility, as crowds gathered around the newly constructed bus shelter at Maple, 4th, where a rusty bench once stood. A gleaming glass and steel structure now rose, its warm lights twinkling against the gray sky. The shelter's copper-tinted roof curved elegantly, designed to direct rainwater away from waiting passengers. Inside, padded benches lined with soft burgundy cushions promised comfort in any weather. Leo bounced on his toes near the shelter's entrance, barely containing his excitement. He wore his special blue coat, the one Grace had saved 3 months to buy, and clutched a small pair of ribbon-cutting scissors in his mittened hands. His eyes darted between the red ribbon stretched across the entrance and the growing crowd of familiar faces. "Mommy, look at all the books." He pointed to the custom-built wooden box mounted inside the shelter, already filled with colorful volumes donated by neighbors. Someone had carved, "Take one, leave one," into the rich mahogany surface. Grace adjusted Leo's woolen hat, her heart full. The shelter was more beautiful than she'd imagined during those early planning meetings at St. Lydia's. Daniel had listened to every suggestion from the community, from the heated benches to the emergency call button discreetly installed near the door. Mavis Green stood near the cocoa stand, orchestrating the final touches with the authority of a symphony conductor. She'd wrapped hand-knitted scarves around the shelter's support beams, splashes of rainbow colors against the sleek metal. The retired teacher had spent weeks rallying volunteers, organizing donations, and ensuring every detail reflected the neighborhood's spirit. "Places, everyone," Mavis called out, her voice carrying over the excited chatter. "Our little Leo's got some ribbon to cut." The crowd shifted, forming a loose semicircle around the shelter's entrance. Parents lifted children onto shoulders for a better view. Bus drivers who'd adjusted their routes to attend stood in their uniforms, thermoses of coffee warming their hands. Even Mr. Drosses of UE. Rodriguez from the corner store had closed early to be there, his arms full of paper bags containing fresh-baked cookies. Daniel emerged from the crowd, looking different from the soaked stranger Grace had first met months ago. He wore a simple brown wool sweater instead of his usual suit, and his eyes crinkled with genuine joy as he knelt beside Leo. "Ready to do the honors, Chief Architect?" Daniel asked, making Leo giggle. The boy had insisted on drawing countless blueprints during the shelter's construction, most featuring impossible additions like rocket boosters and secret tunnels. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mavis stepped forward, tapping a spoon against her cocoa mug for attention. Her voice wavered with emotion as she surveyed the faces before her. This shelter started with a simple act of kindness, an umbrella offered on a rainy morning. But look what blooms when we water those small seeds of grace. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a colorful handkerchief. This isn't just about staying dry while waiting for the number 42 bus. This is about dignity, about saying every person deserves warmth and respect, whether they're carrying a briefcase or a mop bucket. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Grace felt tears prick her own eyes as Mavis continued. "And let me tell you something about the two people who made this happen. They didn't just write checks or make plans. They listened. They showed up. They proved that the best changes come when we build bridges instead of walls." A light drizzle began to fall, but no one moved. If anything, the crowd pressed closer, sharing umbrellas and scarves. The brass band from St. Lydia's struck up a gentle melody, their instruments gleaming in the shelter's warm light. "Leo," Mavis concluded with a flourish, "would you do us the honor?" The boy stepped forward importantly, Daniel steadying his hands as he positioned the scissors. With determined concentration, Leo snipped the ribbon. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As people surged forward to explore the shelter, the band shifted to a livelier tune. Mavis began distributing steaming cups of cocoa topped with miniature marshmallows. Children darted in and out of the shelter, exclaiming over the books and the cushioned seats. Grace stood slightly apart, watching Leo show his favorite features to anyone who would listen. A gentle touch on her elbow made her turn. Daniel stood there, his expression soft in the gathering dusk. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand as the band played a slow, sweet melody. Grace hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. They swayed together on the damp pavement, neither quite leading nor following. The shelter's lights cast a golden glow around them, and the falling drizzle created a shimmering curtain that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. Daniel's hand was warm against her back, and Grace found herself relaxing into the simple movement. They weren't touching any more than politeness required, but something in the careful way he held her spoke volumes about respect and tenderness. Leo's delighted laugh rang out above the music as Mavis spun him in a silly dance of their own. Other couples joined in, creating an impromptu dance floor on the wet sidewalk. The brass band, encouraged by the response, played with renewed enthusiasm. As they turned slowly, Grace noticed small details she'd missed before. The way Daniel's sweater smelled faintly of wool and coffee, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the slight nervousness in his gentle grip. Snowflakes began to drift down, replacing the drizzle. They melted as soon as they touched the warm pavement, but a few caught in Daniel's hair and on his shoulders. The sight made Grace smile. He looked less like a billionaire, and more like a regular person caught in the weather. "Maybe storms can build things, too," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the music and laughter. Grace didn't answer, but her smile deepened as another snowflake landed on his nose. In the shelter's golden light, surrounded by the community's joy, she felt something shift and settle in her heart, like puzzle pieces, finally finding their proper place. Grace's phone buzzed during her lunch break. She usually ignored notifications, but this one came from Maria in housekeeping with an urgent, "You need to see this." Clicking the link, her stomach dropped as she read the headline on Avery Pike's blog, The Daily Dirt. Billionaire builds love nest for secret son. Daniel Whitaker's community project exposed as cover-up. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and half-truths. Pike had woven together the viral video of Leo's innocent comment, photos of the shelter construction, and quotes from anonymous sources close to the situation. Every charitable action had been twisted into something sordid. What better way to keep your mistress close than building her a luxury waiting room? Pike had written. Sources say Whitaker visits the location daily, maintaining a strange vigil that started months before construction began. The timing raises questions about the true nature of his relationship with a certain hotel maid. Grace's hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments section. Strangers dissected her life with cruel speculation. Gold digger found her mark. Poor kid probably isn't even his. These women always know exactly what they're doing. Her phone chimed again, unknown numbers flooding her inbox with messages. How much did you charge him? Stay away from Daniel Whitaker. People like you make me sick. At the Whitaker Foundation offices downtown, Vanessa Chow paced before Daniel's desk, her Louboutin heels clicking against hardwood floors. The Maxwell merger is hanging by a thread, Daniel. The board's already nervous about your hands-on approach to charity. This scandal could sink everything we've worked for. Daniel sat with his head in his hands, his usual composed demeanor cracking. Pike's article is garbage, pure speculation. It doesn't matter if it's true, Vanessa said, her voice tight with concern. The Maxwell family is old money, traditional. They're looking for any excuse to back out of merging their foundation with ours. This kind of publicity. She shook her head. We need to contain this. Fast. I won't throw Grace under the bus, Daniel said firmly. She's done nothing wrong. No one's suggesting that, Vanessa replied carefully. But perhaps some distance would be wise, at least until the merger closes. Daniel's phone lit up with a text from Grace. Have you seen it? Before he could reply, his PR team burst in with crisis management plans. Social media was exploding. News outlets were requesting comments. Pike's blog had crashed from traffic. Back at the hotel, Mr. Harrell cornered Grace in the supply room. "This reflects poorly on our establishment," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Perhaps you should take some personal time until things settle." Grace lifted her chin. "I haven't done anything unprofessional, sir, nevertheless." His tone left no room for argument. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. Even regular guests who normally greeted her warmly now avoided eye contact. Grace focused on her tasks, keeping her movements steady even as her mind raced with worry. She picked up Leo from after-school care, where even the usually chatty coordinator seemed distant. Leo sensed something was wrong but didn't ask, just held her hand tighter as they walked home. Their small apartment felt like a sanctuary until Grace noticed the official envelope that had been slipped under their door. Her fingers shook as she opened it. Notice of home visit. Department of Children and Protective Services. Date: tomorrow, 2:00 p.m. Purpose: welfare check. Response to anonymous report. Grace sank onto their worn couch, the paper crumpling in her grip. Someone had reported her to CPS. The shelter, Daniel's gift to the community, their shared dream of making life better for others, had become a weapon against them. Leo appeared in the doorway of his room, clutching his favorite stuffed penguin. "Mommy, are you okay?" Grace smoothed her face into a calm mask, tucking the notice into her pocket. "Just tired, mi amor. How about we make some hot chocolate?" But as she stirred chocolate powder into warm milk, her phone kept buzzing with notifications. Pike had posted a follow-up article. "Whitaker Hair or Clever Scam? The Truth About the Bus Stop Boy." She turned off her phone. In his penthouse office, Daniel stared at the darkening city skyline. Vanessa had left a stack of documents on his desk, projected losses if the merger failed, PR strategies, even a drafted statement distancing himself from the shelter project. His father's old bus route had passed Maple, 4th. Harold Whitaker had driven that same route for 20 years, proud of his role helping people get where they needed to go. "A city moves on trust," he used to say. Trust in strangers to scoot over, to wait their turn, to help when help's needed. Daniel's phone showed dozens of missed calls from board members and investors, but his eyes fixed on Grace's unanswered text. "Have you seen it?" The shelter's warm lights would be glowing now, books waiting in their wooden box, benches ready to offer rest to tired workers and students. Everything they'd built together, not for headlines or profit, but because it was right, was being painted as something shameful. The CPS notice sat heavy in Grace's pocket as she tucked Leo into bed. "Can we read at the shelter tomorrow?" he asked sleepily. "We'll see, mi amor," she whispered, knowing tomorrow would bring strangers to judge their home, their life, their love. "We'll see." Her apartment felt smaller than usual as she checked the locks, straightened Leo's school supplies, and wiped down already clean counters. The notice seemed to pulse against her hip where she'd tucked it away. Outside her window, the city lights blurred through gathering rain. Somewhere out there, Avery Pike was probably already drafting his next attack. Board members were discussing Daniel's future. Strangers were forming opinions about her character based on cruel assumptions. But here in their small sanctuary, Leo's peaceful breathing carried from his room. His backpack hung neatly by the door, ready for tomorrow. On the fridge, his crayon drawing of the shelter still showed a simple place where people could stay warm and dry, where books waited to be shared, where a community came together. Grace touched the notice in her pocket, straightened her shoulders, and began preparing for tomorrow's inspection. Grace's hands trembled as she wiped down the kitchen counter for the 5th time. The small apartment gleamed from hours of intense cleaning. Every surface sparkled, every toy found its designated home, and even the windows shone crystal clear in the afternoon light. But would it be enough? Leo sat at the kitchen table, carefully coloring within the lines of his bus drawing. "Mommy, why are you cleaning so much? It's already super clean." "Sometimes we need to make things extra special for visitors," Grace said, trying to keep her voice steady. She adjusted the fruit bowl on the counter, making sure the apples faced their best side forward. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet apartment. 2:45. p.m. The CPS caseworker would arrive at 3:00. Grace had ironed her best blouse twice, checking for any loose threads or imperfections. Her work uniform hung pristinely in the closet, evidence of her employment. She'd organized Leo's school records, medical documents, and even his artwork in neat folders on the coffee table. "Can I show the lady my bus collection?" Leo asked, looking up from his drawing. Grace's heart squeezed. "Of course, mijo, but remember what we talked about? Ms. Thompson is coming to have a grown-up conversation with Mommy first." A knock at the door made Grace jump. She checked her watch. 2:50, 2 p.m., early. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her blouse and opened the door. Ms. Thompson wore a navy blazer and carried a leather portfolio. Her smile seemed genuine enough, but Grace noticed how her eyes immediately began scanning the apartment. "Mrs. Delgado? I'm Patricia Thompson from Child Protective Services. Please, come in." Grace stepped aside, gesturing toward the living room. "And it's Ms. Delgado." The caseworker nodded, making a small note. She settled into the armchair while Grace perched on the edge of the couch. Leo looked up from his drawing, curious but remembering his mother's instructions to keep coloring quietly. "You have a lovely home," Ms. Thompson said, opening her portfolio. "Very clean and organized." "Thank you." Grace clasped her hands in her lap to keep them from fidgeting. "We take pride in our space, even if it's small." The questions began, each one feeling like a test Grace couldn't afford to fail. Yes, Leo attended school regularly. No, there had never been any concerns from his teachers. Yes, she maintained steady employment. 8 years at the Grand Palmer Hotel. No, Leo's father had never been in the picture. "And this recent situation with Mr. Whitaker?" Miss Thompson's pen hovered over her notepad. "Could you explain that?" Grace's throat tightened. She explained about the bus stop, the umbrella, Leo's misunderstanding of her bedtime prayer about God being a father to those in need. Her voice grew stronger as she described the community project, careful to emphasize its legitimate, documented nature. Miss Thompson made notes, her expression neutral. "And your current work schedule? I understand there have been some changes." "Mr. Harrell adjusted my shifts," Grace admitted. "But I've documented everything. The schedule changes, the timing, the different treatment compared to other employees." She reached for one of the folders on the coffee table. The caseworker accepted the papers, eyebrows rising slightly at Grace's meticulous records. "You're very organized, Miss Delgado." "I have to be." Grace straightened her shoulders. "I'm all Leo has." A knock interrupted them. Grace's heart skipped. She wasn't expecting anyone else. Opening the door revealed Mavis Green holding a cloth-covered basket, Pastor Joe Williams beside her with a gentle smile. "Oh my, are we interrupting?" Mavis's voice carried its usual warmth, but her eyes held sharp intelligence as they took in the scene. "We just brought some of that honey bread Leo loves so much." Ms. Thompson stood, introducing herself. Mavis seized the opportunity, settling into the room like she owned it. "Well, since we're here, you should know what a blessing Grace and Leo are to this community. That boy has perfect attendance in my Sunday school class, and Grace volunteers at every church event despite working full-time." Pastor Joe added his quiet authority to the conversation. "The Delgados are a vital part of our congregation. Grace has shown remarkable strength and wisdom in raising Leo." The caseworker's pen moved across her notepad again. "It's good to hear from community members. How long have you known the family?" 5 years, Pastor Joe answered. "Since they first moved to the neighborhood, Grace came to us looking for after-school programs for Leo, and they've been faithful members ever since." Mavis had made her way to Leo's table, admiring his drawing. "Show Ms. Thompson your bus route map, sweetheart. The one you made for the shelter project." Leo's face lit up. He retrieved his carefully drawn map, complete with color-coded routes and neat labels in his careful second-grade handwriting. Ms. Thompson examined it with genuine interest. "You did this yourself?" she asked Leo. "Yes, ma'am. I help pick books for the shelter libraries, too. We put in books about buses and maps and stories about helping people." The interview continued for another hour. By the time Ms. Thompson packed up her portfolio, her demeanor had softened noticeably. "I'll be submitting my report next week. Please, Continue maintaining your documentation, Miss Delgado." After the caseworker left, Mavis and Pastor Joe stayed to share the honey bread. Leo happily showed them his newest drawings, while Grace tried to keep her hands from shaking as she poured coffee. "You did well, Grace," Pastor Joe said quietly. "Your preparation showed your dedication to Leo's welfare." Mavis reached across the table to squeeze Grace's hand. "The Lord sees your heart, child. Trust in His timing." They stayed until evening, their presence a steady comfort. Pastor Joe prayed with them before leaving, his words wrapping around Grace like a warm blanket. Mavis left extra food in the fridge, ignoring Grace's protests. Later, after tucking Leo into bed with extra kisses and his favorite bus story, Grace finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. She sank onto her knees beside her bed, tears flowing freely. "God, please don't let them take him," she whispered into clasped hands. "He's my whole world. Please, please don't let them take my baby." The tears fell until exhaustion took over, her prayers becoming silent pleas in the quiet darkness of her room. The autumn wind whipped around the half-built bus shelter at Wilson Pine, where dozens of volunteers in matching blue vests hustled between stacks of lumber and boxes of supplies. Camera crews from 3 local stations jostled for position, their equipment crowding the sidewalk as they captured what should have been a feel-good story about community collaboration. Grace adjusted her yellow safety vest, clipboard pressed to her chest as she directed traffic between workstations. "Paint supplies go to Station 4, she called out, pointing a group of eager college students toward Mavis, who supervised the artistic elements. Daniel stood near the shelter's frame, demonstrating proper nail gun technique to a cluster of attentive volunteers. His suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, a far cry from the pristine businessman she'd first met in the rain. Leo hovered nearby, clutching his beloved notebook where he recorded important construction facts. "Mom," Leo waved from his perch on a stack of sealed lumber. "Mr. Daniel says I can help paint the book box." Grace smiled and checked her watch. "In 15 minutes, sweetheart. First, we need to get your inhaler ready. The dust is pretty bad today." She scanned the immediate area, then frowned. The medical bag wasn't in its usual spot by the supply tent. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Daniel. "Mr. Whitaker, how do you respond to critics who say these shelters are just an elaborate PR stunt?" Daniel's measured response was cut short by a sharp, wheezing sound. Grace's head snapped up. Leo stood rigid, one hand pressed to his chest, eyes wide with panic as he struggled to draw breath. "Leo?" Grace dropped her clipboard and rushed forward. The growing crowd parted as she reached for her son. "Where's his bag?" she called out. "The red medical bag? Who moved it?" Daniel spun around, his face draining of color as he saw Leo gasping. He took 3 steps forward, then stopped dead in his tracks. His hands hung uselessly at his sides. "It was by the paint supplies," someone shouted. "Check the truck," called another. Grace held Leo close, rubbing his back as his breathing grew more labored. "Stay calm, mijito. Nice and slow." But her own voice shook with fear. The cameras swung toward the unfolding crisis. Phones appeared in raised hands, recording. Daniel stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Leo, but seeing something else entirely. A different emergency, a different day, when his father collapsed on his bus route and he couldn't save him. "The inhaler!" Mavis appeared, waving the red bag. "Found it behind the supply boxes." Grace snatched the bag, fingers trembling, as she dug out the inhaler. Leo's lips had taken on a bluish tinge. She helped him take 2 quick puffs, counting the seconds between them just as they'd practiced so many times before. Through it all, Daniel remained motionless. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His breath came in short gasps that eerily echoed Leo's struggle. "Sir? Mr. Whitaker?" A volunteer touched his arm. He flinched, violently. Grace heard the murmurs rising from the crowd. Saw the phone still recording. Caught fragments of whispered commentary. "Why isn't he helping? Just standing there." Some father figure. Gradually, Leo's breathing steadied. Color returned to his cheeks as the medication took effect. He sagged against Grace, exhausted but safe. She pressed her lips to his forehead, her own heart still racing. Only then did she look up at Daniel. He had backed away several steps, his face a mask of anguish and shame. Their eyes met across the space between them, a space that suddenly felt vast and unbridgeable. A reporter's voice cut through the tense silence. "Mr. Whitaker, would you care to comment on your response to the medical emergency?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands shook visibly now. Grace gathered Leo closer, protecting him from the cameras, from the whispers, from the weight of all these watching eyes. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "I think you should go, Daniel." He stared at her, stricken. Understanding dawned in his eyes. This wasn't just about today. This was about Leo's safety, his stability, his future. About protecting him from becoming another viral moment, another news cycle, another piece of ammunition in a war of reputations. "Grace, Daniel started. "Please," she cut him off gently. "Just step back, for Leo's sake." The cameras captured it all. Daniel's slow retreat, the defeat in his shoulders, the way he stumbled slightly as he turned away. Grace watched him go, feeling something precious crumbling between them, but knowing she had to choose her son's well-being over everything else. Leo's small voice broke the silence. "Mom, is Mr. Daniel mad at me?" "No, my amor." Grace smoothed his hair, fighting back tears. "He's not mad at all. Sometimes grown-ups just need to take a step back to make things better." Around them, the shelter stood half-finished, its incomplete frame casting broken shadows across the sidewalk. The volunteers slowly returned to their tasks, but the joy had gone out of the project. Phones buzzed with notifications as the first clips began to circulate online. Grace helped Leo to his feet, gathering their things. She caught a glimpse of a news headline already forming on someone's screen. "Billionaire can't even help his own kid." The words burned in her vision. Unfair, but unchangeable. Like so much else in this situation, Mavis appeared at her elbow with their coats. "Let me drive you both home," she offered quietly. Grace nodded, too drained to argue. As they walked to Mavis's car, she didn't look back at the unfinished shelter. She couldn't bear to see another thing left broken and incomplete. The morning light filtered weakly through the hotel's administrative wing windows as Grace walked the familiar path to Mr. Harrell's office. Her shoes, polished to a perfect shine just that morning, clicked against the marble flooring with each step. The sound echoed in the empty hallway, marking time like a ticking clock, counting down to something inevitable. Mr. Harrell sat behind his mahogany desk, his posture rigid and formal. A manila folder lay centered precisely on his desk blotter. The room smelled of leather and artificial pine, making Grace's nose itch. "Please, sit down, Ms. Delgado." His voice carried that practiced tone of false sympathy that made her stomach clench. Grace smoothed her uniform skirt and took the hard-backed chair across from him. She kept her spine straight, chin level, the way her mother had taught her. Dignity, always dignity. "I'm afraid we need to discuss your continued employment with the Grand Palmer Hotel." Mr. Harrell's fingers drummed once on the folder. "There have been incidents." "Incidents, sir?" Grace's voice remained steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Multiple late arrivals." He flipped open the folder. "Unauthorized breaks. Disruption of hotel events. Inappropriate fraternization with guests." Each accusation landed like a slap. "And, most recently, your involvement in activities that have brought negative attention to this establishment." Grace's hands tightened in her lap. "Those accusations aren't true, Mr. Harrell. I have documentation of my punctuality, and my break times are logged properly. As for the other matters, Ms. Delgado," he cut her off with a raised hand, "the decision has already been made. We're terminating your employment, effective immediately." The words hung in the air between them. Grace felt the room tilt slightly, but she refused to show weakness. On what grounds? For cause. Mr. Harrell's thin lips curved in what might have been meant as a smile, but looked more like a grimace. "Your final check will be mailed to the address we have on file. Please, surrender your ID badge and keys." Grace's fingers trembled as she unpinned her name badge. 5 years of service, reduced to a plastic rectangle sliding across polished wood. The master key followed, the metal warm from being pressed against her hip all morning. "Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. That won't be necessary." Grace stood, her movements careful and measured. "I know the way." Mr. Harrell's expression tightened. "Policy requires, I'll walk myself out." The words came out firmer than she'd intended. But Grace couldn't bear the thought of being marched through the service corridors like a criminal. Not in front of her co-workers. Not in front of anyone. She turned and walked to the door, her head high despite the burning in her eyes. Just before she stepped out, Mr. Harrell spoke again. "You should have taken the settlement offer, Ms. Delgado. It would have been easier." Grace didn't respond. She simply closed the door behind her with a soft click that felt like the period at the end of a chapter she never wanted to write. The rest of the day passed in a blur. She rode 3 different buses home, taking the long way to avoid familiar faces and questions she couldn't answer. The apartment felt colder than usual when she finally unlocked the door, even though the heating was working fine. Leo was at an after-school program until 6, giving her 2 hours to fall apart in private. But she couldn't afford even that luxury. Instead, Grace pulled out her worn leather folder of bills and spread them across the kitchen table like a tarot reading of her future. The numbers stared back at her, unforgiving. Rent due in 2 weeks. Electric bill marked final notice in red. Leo's asthma medication needed refilling. The calendar on the wall showed the CPS visit scheduled for next Tuesday, circled in thick black marker. She was still sitting there when Mrs. Rodriguez from next door dropped Leo off. His backpack thumped to the floor as he ran to hug her, smelling of crayons and apple juice. "Mommy! We made paper airplanes today and mine flew all the way across the gym." His excitement faltered when he saw her face. "Are you sad?" Grace pulled him onto her lap, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "Just tired, my Joe. Tell me more about your airplane." Leo snuggled against her chest, his small body warm and trusting. He chattered about his day while Grace stroked his hair, her other hand absently shuffling bills into a neat stack. His voice grew slower, drowsier, until he dozed off right there in the kitchen chair. The streetlight outside cast orange shadows through the window. Grace watched them stretch across her unpaid bills, across Leo's peaceful face, across the empty chair where Daniel had sat just last week, planning bus shelters and futures that now seemed like fairy tales. Rain began to fall outside, pattering against the window in a rhythm that matched the ache in her chest. Across town, in the gathering darkness, Daniel sat alone at the Maple 4th bus stop. The same bench where everything had started weeks ago, with a simple act of kindness. His umbrella was open above him, but he barely noticed the shelter it provided. His eyes were closed, face turned up to feel the rain that snuck past the umbrella's edge. His lips moved in a whisper that only the night could hear. "Show me how to stay." The words dissolved into the sound of falling rain, leaving him alone with the weight of everything that had broken, and the crushing uncertainty of how to make it right. Behind his closed eyelids, he saw Leo's face twisted in panic during the asthma attack. Saw Grace's expression when she'd told him to step back. Saw his own reflection in the hotel's polished windows. A man with all the money in the world, but no idea how to protect the people who had somehow become more precious than any fortune. The rain continued to fall, soaking into his expensive wool coat, but Daniel didn't move. He sat in the growing puddles, letting the cold seep into his bones, whispering those same words over and over like a prayer. "Show me how to stay." The bus stop remained empty except for him. A solitary figure, illuminated by a flickering streetlight, holding an umbrella that couldn't shield him from the storm that mattered most. A gentle knock echoed through Grace's apartment. She lifted her head from the pile of bills scattered across her kitchen table, quickly wiping away tears with the back of her hand. Through the peephole, she saw Pastor Joe's familiar silhouette, his arms loaded with brown paper grocery bags. "Just a minute," Grace called, her voice scratchy. She unlocked the 3 deadbolts, each click reminding her of how much she needed to protect. Pastor Joe's warm smile greeted her as she opened the door. "I hope you don't mind some company and a few provisions," he said softly, mindful of Leo sleeping in the next room. Grace started to protest, but Pastor Joe was already moving past her toward the kitchen. "The church always has extra from the food bank. Better in your pantry than going to waste." She watched as he began unloading the bags, fresh vegetables, bread, milk, and other staples. The sight of such abundance made her throat tight. "Pastor, I can't." "Faith is showing up when it's inconvenient," he interrupted gently, continuing to stock her nearly empty cabinets. "And sometimes faith looks like letting others show up for you." Grace sank into a kitchen chair, suddenly exhausted. "I don't know what to do anymore. Mr. Harrell, he's been waiting for any excuse." Pastor Joe pulled up a chair beside her, his movements deliberate and calm. "Tell me everything," he said, gesturing to the scattered papers on the table. Grace began sorting through the documents with trembling hands. "I've kept records of every scheduled change, every time he's moved my shifts without notice." She pulled out a small notebook filled with neat handwriting. "The dates other workers got schedule accommodations that I was denied. Times he's made comments about my kind." "Smart girl," Pastor Joe nodded approvingly. "Mavis taught you well." As if summoned by her name, another knock sounded. This time it was Mavis herself, brandishing her own folder of papers. "I've got statements," Mavis announced in a fierce whisper, mindful of Leo. "3 other maids willing to testify about the differential treatment, plus that new girl from accounting. She's got copies of the official schedule changes." Grace stared at her former teacher. "How did you—" "Honey, I taught half this neighborhood. My kids grow up, but they don't forget who helped them learn to read." Mavis settled into another chair, spreading out her documents. "And I've got something else. Remember Betty from the front desk? She's been keeping a log of every discriminatory comment that Snake Harrell has made." Pastor Joe studied the growing pile of evidence. "This is good, very good. But we need more than just paper. We need voices willing to stand up." "Already on it," Mavis declared. "I've got the whole bus stop crowd ready to speak about your character. Mrs. Chen from the convenience store, Mr. Rodriguez from the garage. They've all seen you with Leo every morning, rain or shine, never late." Grace felt overwhelmed by their efficiency, their ready support. "But the hotel chain, they're so big. And Mr. Harrell has connections." "Size isn't everything," Pastor Joe said quietly. "David had his 5 stones. We have truth and community." As if to emphasize his point, Grace's phone buzzed with messages. Her co-workers were organizing a support group. The neighborhood Facebook page was filling with offers of help. Even some of the regular hotel guests had heard about her firing and were writing letters of protest. "See?" Mavis gestured at the phone. "You're not alone in this storm, child." Grace looked at the growing stack of evidence, the full cabinets, the messages of support lighting up her phone. She thought of Leo sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the army gathering to protect his future. "What's our next step?" she asked, straightening her shoulders. Pastor Joe smiled. "First, we organize everything. Then we take it to the hotel chain's regional office, bypass Harrell completely. Mavis has a contact in their HR department. And if that doesn't work," Mavis added with a glint in her eye, "we go public. I may be retired, but I still know every local news reporter worth their salt." They worked late into the night, organizing documents, crafting statements, building their case piece by piece. Pastor Joe made coffee while Mavis told stories about other battles she'd fought and won. Slowly, Grace felt strength returning to her spirit. When Leo stirred briefly, calling out in his sleep, Grace went to soothe him. She returned to find Pastor Joe and Mavis had cleaned up the kitchen and arranged everything in labeled folders. "Get some rest," Pastor Joe advised, gathering his coat. "Tomorrow's another day to stand strong." Mavis hugged her tightly. "We've got your back, honey. All of us." After they left, Grace stood in her kitchen, looking at the now full cabinets, the organized evidence, the phone still buzzing with messages of support. She walked to her bedroom and set her alarm for dawn, determination replacing despair. She wouldn't bow to injustice. Not with so many standing beside her, not with Leo's future at stake. The storm hit Chicago like a furious giant, hurling sheets of icy rain against windows and whipping trash bins down empty streets. Lightning crackled across the pewter sky, followed by thunder that made buildings shiver. Most people had fled indoors, leaving Maple 4th deserted except for one man. Daniel Whitaker stood alone at the bus stop, his expensive suit plastered to his body. His normally perfect hair hung in wet strands across his forehead, water streaming down his face. He didn't bother seeking shelter under the new awning he'd helped build. Instead, he planted himself at the edge of the sidewalk, holding a soggy piece of paper in trembling hands. Several cars slowed as they passed, drivers squinting through foggy windshields at the Billionaire standing in the downpour. A few pulled out phones to record the strange sight. Daniel ignored them all, his eyes fixed on the paper he gripped like a lifeline. The handwritten words began to blur as rain pelted the page, but he knew them by heart. He'd spent all night writing and rewriting until every sentence rang true. I will not offer money to silence truth. I will not demand tests to prove worth. I will not allow legal weapons to be used against a mother protecting her child. The merger can fail. The foundation will survive. But I won't stand by while good people lose everything for doing nothing wrong. His hands shook harder, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The paper continued. Today I pledge $5 million to create the Workers' Defense Fund, providing legal aid to service employees targeted by discriminatory practices. This is not charity. This is justice. More cars stopped. Phone cameras recorded. Someone shouted his name, but Daniel kept his eyes on the paper, reading the final lines aloud to the storm. I learned about dignity from a woman who gave away her only umbrella. I learned about strength from her son's smile. I learned that real power isn't in what you can take, but in what you choose to give up. Wind tore at his clothes. Lightning split the sky again. Daniel's voice grew stronger. I choose to stand here, in this storm, until the world sees what matters. One umbrella. One bus stop. One family doing right by each other. That's worth more than any merger. Reporters began arriving, drawn by social media alerts about the billionaire's strange behavior. Their cameras caught him as he stood straighter, chest heaving with emotion he'd held back too long. To Grace Delgado, I'm sorry I didn't stand with you sooner. To Leo, I'm sorry I froze when you needed help. To everyone watching, look at what happens when we let fear of losing status matter more than protecting each other. The crowd grew. Phones lifted. Daniel's voice carried over the thunder. I won't hide behind lawyers anymore. I won't let money be used as a weapon. And I won't move from this spot until Grace knows she's not alone. He fell silent then, rain washing over him like tears he couldn't shed. Minutes ticked by. The storm raged. Daniel remained motionless, paper dissolving in his grip, while cameras captured every moment. A subtle movement caught his eye. Through the curtain of rain, he saw Grace step quietly into the bus shelter. She held a familiar umbrella, the one that had started everything. Their eyes met across the distance, but neither spoke. Grace simply stood there, watching the man who had finally chosen to weather the storm instead of trying to control it. More reporters arrived with bright lights and microphones, but Daniel didn't turn away from Grace's gaze. He had said what needed saying. Now he would wait, letting action speak louder than any written words. Vanessa Chow stood before the merger board in their gleaming downtown conference room, her usual pristine composure tested but unbroken. 12 stern faces stared back at her from around the massive mahogany table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the storm continued its assault on Chicago. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, I'm here to discuss Daniel Whitaker's position regarding recent events. She placed her tablet on the podium, but didn't look at it. She knew every word by heart. This is highly irregular. Bernard Matthews, the lead board member, interrupted. His jowls quivered with disapproval. The merger agreement clearly stated, with respect, Mr. Matthews, Vanessa cut in. Irregular times call for irregular measures. She squared her shoulders. Mr. Whitaker has made his position clear. He will not abandon his principles for this merger. Murmurs rippled through the room. A woman in a sharp navy suit leaned forward. Miss Chow, surely you understand the optics here. The scandal, the only scandal, Vanessa said firmly, is that we're even discussing whether to support a man who's standing up against workplace discrimination. She tapped a button on her remote, bringing up surveillance footage of Mr. Harrell's selective scheduling practices on the wall screen. Across town, Mavis Green marched into the hotel chain's corporate headquarters. her rain boots squeaking against the polished marble floor. She carried a thick binder in her arms, held close like precious cargo. The security guard recognized her from her previous visits and didn't even try to stop her. "Morning, Jerome," she called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day for justice, isn't it?" The guard hid a smile and pretended to be very interested in his computer screen. Mavis rode the elevator to the executive floor, humming gospel tunes under her breath. When the doors opened, she found herself face to face with Mr. Harrell himself. His usual smug expression faltered. "Mrs. Green," he said stiffly, "this is a restricted area." "Oh, I know exactly where I am," Mavis replied, patting the binder. "And I know exactly where this needs to go." She stepped around him like he was nothing more than a potted plant, making her way to the CEO's office. Back in the merger board room, Vanessa was displaying employee testimonies on the screen. "These aren't just numbers," she said. "These are people, parents trying to feed their children, workers who've given years of loyal service, only to face discrimination when it became inconvenient to protect them." Bernard Matthews' face had grown increasingly red. "This is business, Ms. Chow, not some social justice crusade." "No," Vanessa agreed, her voice like steel. "This is leadership, and Daniel Whitaker is showing us what that really looks like." She straightened to her full height. "So, here are your options. Either support this new direction and be part of positive change, or step aside. There will be other mergers. There won't be another chance to do what's right." In the hotel CEO's office, Mavis spread out her evidence like a general planning a campaign. 342 signatures, she announced, laying down the petition. 57 employee testimonies. 12 instances of documented discrimination. She fixed the CEO with a grandmother's stern gaze. And one very clear choice. The CEO, Amanda Chen, studied the materials with growing concern. "This is comprehensive," she admitted. "We had time to be thorough while you were being negligent," Mavis replied sweetly. She pulled out one final document. "And here's the coverage we've prepared for major news outlets. I particularly like the headline, 'Luxury Hotel Chain Faces Discrimination Scandal.'" She paused. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer a different story." In Grace's small apartment, Leo was doing homework at the kitchen table when someone knocked. Grace opened the door to find a courier holding an official-looking envelope. "Ms. Delgado?" The courier held out his electronic pad. "Sign here, please." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she signed. She recognized the hotel chain's logo on the envelope. With Leo watching curiously, she opened it and began to read. "Dear Ms. Delgado," the letter began, "we write to formally rescind your termination." Her eyes blurred with tears as she continued reading. The letter acknowledged the discriminatory nature of her firing, offered full reinstatement with back pay, and concluded with an unequivocal apology. She sank into a kitchen chair, the paper crackling in her grip. Leo came over and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Is it good news, Mommy?" Grace pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Yes, mijo, it's very good news." In the merger boardroom, Vanessa was gathering her materials as the board members filed out. Some looked angry, others thoughtful. Bernard Matthews was the last to leave. "Ms. Chow," he said, pausing at the door. "Tell Mr. Whitaker. Tell him we'll be in touch about revised terms." He cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's room for both profit and principle." Vanessa allowed herself a small smile as the door closed behind him. She pulled out her phone to text Daniel, but stopped. He would still be at that bus stop in the rain, waiting. Some messages were better delivered in person. At the hotel's corporate office, Mavis watched with satisfaction as Amanda Chen personally signed the reinstatement letter. The CEO handed it to her assistant with clear instructions. "Deliver this immediately, and start an internal review of all scheduling practices." Mavis nodded approvingly. "Now that's what I call corporate responsibility." She gathered her now empty binder. "I'll be watching to make sure you follow through." "I don't doubt that for a moment, Mrs. Green," the CEO replied, and for the first time there was respect in her voice. Grace sat at her kitchen table, long after Leo had gone back to his homework, reading and rereading the letter. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. A thin shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a rainbow against her wall. She thought of Daniel, still standing in the rain at Maple 4th, still waiting, still choosing to stay. The old shuttle depot buzzed with life on a crisp December morning. Red and gold streamers danced in the winter breeze, transforming the usually plain brick building into something magical. The scent of hot cocoa wafted through the air from a makeshift stand where Mavis handed out steaming cups topped with whipped cream and sprinkles. Children wrapped in colorful scarves darted between adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the brass band's cheerful music. The local high school jazz ensemble, positioned near the entrance, filled the space with warm melodies that made even the most serious onlookers tap their feet. Grace stood near the back, taking it all in. Her work uniform was replaced by a simple blue dress she'd found on sale, and her usually tired eyes sparkled with joy. Leo bounced beside her in his Sunday best, clutching a small pair of scissors wrapped in a red ribbon. "Mommy, look!" Leo pointed to where Daniel was helping Pastor Joe hang the last of the decorations. "Mr. Daniel's wearing his work clothes like us." Sure enough, Daniel had traded his usual suit for jeans and a flannel shirt, tool belt slung low on his hips. Daniel caught their gaze and walked over, dust coating his sleeves. "Ready for the big moment, Leo?" he asked, ruffling the boy's hair. "I practice with paper," Leo declared proudly. "Mavis helped me get really good at cutting straight lines." The crowd began to gather around the veiled structure. The new bus shelter stood proud and tall, its outline hinting at something far more substantial than the usual glass boxes dotting the city streets. A large cloth covered the dedication plaque, stirring gently in the breeze. Vanessa appeared at Daniel's side, tablet in hand. For once, she wasn't checking emails, but instead snapped photos of the community celebration. "The press is here," she whispered to Daniel, "but only the local outlets you approved." The brass band quieted as Pastor Joe stepped forward, his warm voice carrying across the depot. "Friends and neighbors, we're here today to celebrate more than just a building. We're here to honor the spirit of community that brought us together." The crowd clapped, and several voices called out, "Amen!" Pastor Joe gestured to Daniel, who walked to the front, his usual confidence tempered by visible emotion. "This shelter," Daniel began, his voice catching slightly, "is dedicated to Ruth and Harold Whitaker." He paused, gathering himself. "My father drove buses in Chicago for 30 years. He knew every route, every stop, every regular passenger by name. My mother waited for him at this very depot every evening, rain or shine." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as Daniel continued. "They taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch. Dad never met a stranger he wouldn't help, and Mom never saw a person who didn't deserve kindness." He looked directly at Grace and Leo. "Sometimes it takes a child's wisdom and a mother's grace to remind us of life's simplest truths." Leo tugged at Grace's dress. "That's us, Mommy. He's talking about us." The crowd chuckled warmly, and Daniel smiled. "Leo, would you do the honors?" Leo practically skipped to the front, his small scissors held carefully in both hands. Daniel lifted him up so he could reach the ribbon stretched across the shelter's entrance. The crowd began to count down. 3, 2, 1. With determined concentration, Leo lined up the scissors and made the cut. The ribbon fluttered to the ground as cheers erupted. "Leo! Leo! Leo!" the crowd chanted, making the boy beam with pride. Daniel set Leo down and pulled the cloth from the dedication plaque. In simple, elegant letters it read, "The Ruth Harold Whitaker Memorial Shelter, where everyone has a place to wait in dignity. Dedicated to the memory of those who kept our city moving." The shelter itself was a testament to both beauty and function. Warm wood panels lined the interior, with built-in heating for winter months. A small library box held books for all ages. Solar panels on the roof powered charging stations for phones and devices. Most touching were the hand-carved benches, each bearing the name of a longtime neighborhood resident. The brass band struck up again as people began exploring the shelter. Children immediately gravitated to the library box, while elderly neighbors settled onto the benches with satisfied sighs. Mavis directed traffic at the cocoa stand, making sure everyone got their share of warmth. Daniel found Grace standing just inside the shelter, her hand trailing along the smooth wood. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "I hope so," Daniel replied, watching Leo show his friends how to use the charging stations. "He always said a city's heart beats at its bus stops. That's where stories begin and end, where strangers become neighbors." The celebration continued around them, a perfect blend of joyful chaos and community pride. Pastor Joe led impromptu carol singing, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. Children played tag around the shelter's perimeter while their parents chatted and shared cocoa. The local news crew captured it all, focusing on the faces rather than the structure itself. Leo ran back to Grace and Daniel, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Can we ride the bus now, please? I want to sit in our shelter." "Our shelter," Daniel repeated, tasting the words. He looked at Grace, his eyes asking permission. She nodded, smile widening. "Yes, Leo, our shelter." The crowd continued to chant Leo's name as he bounced on his toes, ready for their first bus ride together. Daniel watched them both, his eyes shining with unshed tears, as the morning sun broke through the clouds and illuminated the shelter like a beacon of hope. The festive chatter died down as someone dimmed the depot's overhead lights. A hush fell over the crowd. Daniel stood near the newly dedicated bus shelter, its brass plaque gleaming with his parents' names. Ruth, Harold Whitaker. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket. Grace watched him from a few steps away, Leo's small hand wrapped tightly in hers. The past months had changed them all. She could see it in the way Daniel carried himself now, less like a man apart and more like someone who had finally found his place in the world. "Grace," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the quiet depot. "When you gave me that umbrella, you didn't just keep me dry. You showed me what real giving looks like." He took a step closer, and Grace noticed he wasn't reaching for a ring box. Instead, he pulled out something that caught the light differently, flat and metallic. "Before I ask you the big question," Daniel continued, his voice growing softer, more intimate despite their audience, "I want to share something with you and Leo." He knelt down, not on one knee as she'd expected, but on both, making himself eye level with Leo. In his hands was a shiny bus pass, its surface engraved with delicate letters that caught the light. "A family is who shows up," Daniel read aloud, running his finger along the words. "This pass is for all three of us, because showing up is what matters at bus stops, in storms, in life." Leo's eyes widened as he studied the pass. "Like when you waited for us every morning?" "Exactly like that, buddy." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. He looked up at Grace, his eyes shining. "Grace Delgado, you taught me that presence beats distance every single time. You showed me that love isn't about grand gestures or solving problems with money. It's about being there, day after day, rain or shine." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes as Daniel continued. "You and Leo have given me something I never knew I was missing, a chance to be part of a real family. To learn what it means to show up, to stand together, to love without conditions." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "I don't want to just give you back that umbrella anymore. I want to share every storm and every rainbow with you both." The depot was so quiet you could hear the gentle whir of the heating vents. Mavis clutched Pastor Joe's arm, both of them beaming. Even Mr. Harrell, standing near the back, seemed moved. "Grace," Daniel said, his voice steady now despite the tears in his eyes, "will you marry me?" Before Grace could answer, she felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. Leo looked up at her, his face serious and hopeful all at once. "Mommy," he whispered, though in the silence everyone could hear, "can we sit together on the bus forever?" Grace let out a laugh that was half sob, looking between her son and the man kneeling before them, the man who had waited in the rain, who had chosen them over his reputation, who had learned to show up in all the ways that mattered. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she reached for Daniel's hand. "Yes, to both questions." Daniel stood, pulling Grace into an embrace that lifted her slightly off her feet. Leo squeezed between them, wrapping his arms around their legs as cheers erupted throughout the depot. Mavis started clapping first, then Pastor Joe, and soon the whole space thundered with applause and joyful shouts. Daniel held them both tight, and Grace could feel his heart beating strong and steady against her chest. This was what family felt like. Not perfect, not simple, but real, and present, and true. Someone started playing music again, and the crowd surged forward to congratulate them. But for a moment, Grace, Daniel, and Leo stayed wrapped in their embrace, a family built, not by blood or circumstance, but by the simple, profound act of showing up for each other, day after day. Leo held the bus pass up to the light, watching it sparkle. "Can we ride the bus right now?" Daniel laughed, wiping tears from his eyes. "How about we celebrate with everyone here first, buddy? Then tomorrow morning, we'll all catch the 7:10 together." Grace smiled, remembering that first rainy morning at Maple, 4th. "Same stop?" she asked softly. "Same stop," Daniel confirmed, squeezing her hand. "Always." The cheers continued around them, but in that moment, they were in their own world. A family, forged at a bus stop, strengthened by storms, and now celebrating under the shelter they'd built together. The hotel's grand lobby buzzed with activity as staff gathered around the reception desk. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Mr. 718ZZ. Harold stood stiffly at the front desk, his usual polished appearance slightly disheveled. His hands shook as he straightened his tie one last time. The regional manager, Mrs. Chen, stepped forward with a stern expression. "After reviewing the evidence of discriminatory practices and unfair scheduling, we have accepted Mr. Harrell's resignation effective immediately." Her voice carried clearly through the hushed space. Grace stood quietly among her co-workers, her head held high. She felt Mavis's reassuring presence beside her as Mrs. Chen continued speaking. "Furthermore, we are implementing new worker protection policies across all our properties." Mrs. Chen gestured to a stack of documents. "These include fair scheduling practices, anti-discrimination training, and a clear reporting system for workplace concerns." Mr. Harrell's face tightened as he gathered his belongings from the office. The same office where he had threatened Grace's livelihood just months ago. Now he walked past her without meeting her eyes, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Once he disappeared through the revolving doors, Mrs. Chen approached Grace with a warm smile. "Ms. Delgado, we owe you an official apology. Your unfair termination has been completely expunged from your record." She paused, then added, "We would like to offer you a position as housekeeping supervisor, with full benefits and a significant raise." Grace's co-workers burst into applause. Maria, who had worked alongside her for years, wrapped her in a tight hug. "Felicidades, amiga, you deserve this." The celebration spread through the lobby, but Grace noticed Daniel standing quietly near the entrance. He approached with that familiar shy smile she'd grown to love. "I have some news too," he said softly. "The foundation just approved funding for the Umbrella Fund." He pulled out architectural drawings, showing similar shelters planned for stops across Chicago. "Every neighborhood deserves dignity while waiting for the bus." Grace traced the drawings with her finger, remembering that first rainy morning at Maple, 4th. "How many shelters?" 20 to start, Daniel replied, "each one managed by local residents, just like ours. We're prioritizing routes near schools and hospitals." The plans included everything they'd learned worked well. Heated benches, book exchanges, emergency phones, and those special pegs where people could leave spare umbrellas for others in need. Mrs. Chen joined them, reviewing the drawings with interest. "The hotel chain would like to contribute to this initiative," she announced. "Perhaps we could sponsor several shelters near our properties." Daniel nodded. "We'd welcome the partnership, especially if it comes with fair workplace practices." Grace felt overwhelmed by how much had changed. Just months ago, she'd been scrubbing glasses in this lobby, trying to stay invisible. Now she stood here as a supervisor, watching her small act of kindness ripple out into something bigger than herself. Later that afternoon, Grace slipped into St. Lydia's quiet sanctuary. The familiar scent of beeswax candles and old wood wrapped around her like a comfort. She made her way to the prayer alcove, where she'd spent so many worried hours during the darkest days of the controversy. This time, she lit a single candle with steady hands. The flame flickered in the stillness as she whispered her thanks. Thanks for justice served without bitterness. Thanks for dignity restored. Thanks for a community that stood together. And most of all, thanks for the mysterious ways God had turned one small umbrella into a shelter for so many. The late afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass, painting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. Grace stayed kneeling in that peaceful moment, her heart full of gratitude for mercy that flowed like gentle rain, washing away the bitter and leaving everything fresh and new. A practical voice in her head reminded her that Leo would be finishing school soon. She needed to head to the bus stop. But this time, she wasn't going alone or in fear. This time, she was going as someone who had stood her ground with grace and seen justice prevail. Delicate snowflakes drifted past the apartment windows, coating Chicago in a pristine white blanket. Inside Grace's cozy living room, warmth radiated from both the small space heater and the love filling the room. A modest pine tree stood in the corner, its fresh scent mingling with the aroma of cinnamon and chocolate. Leo bounced on his tiptoes, carefully holding a glittering red ornament. "Can I put this one up high, Mommy? Please?" Grace smiled, her eyes soft with joy. "Sure, mijo. Just let Daniel help you, okay?" Daniel stepped forward, his suit jacket long discarded and his sleeves rolled up. He lifted Leo with gentle hands, his movements still carrying a trace of awkwardness that made Grace's heart melt. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms now spent his evenings learning the simple art of being a family man. "Higher," Leo giggled, stretching toward an empty branch. "It needs to catch all the light." "Expert decorator, aren't you?" Daniel chuckled, steadying the boy as he placed the ornament. "Is this a skill they teach in second grade now?" "Nope," Leo declared proudly. "Mavis showed me. She says decorating is like telling a story with pretty things." As if summoned by her name, a knock echoed through the apartment. Mavis's voice carried through the door. "Anyone order a grandmother with hot cocoa?" Grace hurried to let her in, laughing at the sight of Mavis balanced with 2 thermoses and a large bag of popcorn. The retired teacher bustled in, shaking snow from her wool cap. "Lord, it's like a Christmas card in here," Mavis exclaimed, setting down her offerings. "Though that tree's looking a mite bare on one side, Daniel Whitaker. Don't tell me you've never strung popcorn before?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a sheepish grin crossing his face. "I'm afraid my Christmas experience has been limited. Usually involved charity galas and corporate gifts." "Well, honey, you're getting the real deal now." Mavis settled into the armchair like a queen taking her throne. "Grace, get this man a needle and thread. Leo, you're on popcorn quality control." They gathered around the coffee table, mugs of Mavis's rich cocoa warming their hands. Leo took his job seriously, carefully inspecting each piece of popcorn before passing it to Daniel. Grace watched, amused, as Daniel's confident fingers fumbled with the delicate task. "How do you keep them from breaking?" he asked, after his third attempt ended with crushed popcorn. "Gentle touch," Grace demonstrated, her small hands moving smoothly, like handling something precious. Daniel's eyes met hers over the scattered popcorn. "I'm learning that lesson in many ways lately." Mavis snorted into her cocoa. "Lord, you two are sweet enough to give me cavities, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Someone's got to be the designated grandmother around here." "You were grandmother by default, long before Daniel came along," Grace reminded her warmly. "Remember Leo's first day of school? Ha! That boy marched right up to me and asked if I had any candy in my purse, just like a proper grandchild should." Mavis reached over to ruffle Leo's hair, nearly gave his mama a heart attack with that boldness. Leo beamed at the memory, chocolate mustache decorating his upper lip. "And you did have candy? The good kind with the stretchy taffy inside?" "Still do, baby, still do." Mavis patted her enormous purse with a wink. Daniel finally managed to string 3 pieces of popcorn without destruction. "Victory," he declared, holding up his achievement. "Oh, bless your heart," Mavis laughed. "We'll make a craftsman of you yet." They worked together as the snow continued falling outside, building chains of popcorn and memories. Daniel's garland ended up looking like a modern art installation, uneven, broken in places, but made with determination and love. Grace insisted it go front and center on the tree. "It's perfect," she said firmly when Daniel tried to hide it in the back. "Because it's real." The tree slowly transformed, twinkling with small lights and mismatched ornaments. Each decoration had a story. Leo's handprint in clay from kindergarten, the glass angel Grace's mother had given her, a tiny bus ornament Daniel had found specially for Leo. "Now that's what I call a Christmas tree," Mavis declared, standing back to admire their work. "Got more personality than any fancy department store display." Leo yawned, though he tried to hide it behind his hand. Grace recognized the signs of an overtired 7-year-old. "Time for bed, my Joe. Say goodnight to Mavis and Daniel." "But Mommy—" Leo started to protest, then yawned again. "No buts," Grace said gently. "Remember what tomorrow is?" Leo's eyes widened. "Bus shelter? Decorating, that's right. And you need your rest to be head decorator." Mavis gathered her things, giving Leo an extra tight hug. "Sleep tight, sweet boy. Save some of that decorating energy for your old Grandma Mavis tomorrow." After helping Mavis to her car, Daniel returned to find Grace tucking Leo into bed. He stood in the doorway, watching as Leo clasped his hands for his nightly prayer. "Thank you, God," Leo whispered, his voice heavy with sleep. "For Mommy and Daniel and Mavis and our pretty tree. And for bus shelters and cocoa and popcorn that doesn't break too much. And thank you that we all found each other. Amen." "Amen," Grace echoed softly, kissing his forehead. In the living room, the tree lights cast a gentle glow. Daniel drew Grace close, his touch still carrying that wonderful hint of uncertainty, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" "For teaching me what Christmas really means, what family means." Grace lifted her face to his, and their lips met in a kiss that held all the reverence of a prayer, gentle, grateful, and full of promise. Twilight settled over Chicago like a gentle whisper, bringing with it a fine dusting of snow. The maple 4th bus shelter glowed warmly against the deepening blue of evening, its golden lights reflecting off the fresh powder. The structure stood as a beacon of hope so different from the rusty awning of months past. Inside, the heated bench radiated comfortable warmth. Books lined the built-in shelves, their spines creating a rainbow of colors against the polished wood. A small hot water dispenser hummed quietly in the corner, ready to dispense hot water for the basket of cocoa packets Mavis insisted on keeping stocked. Grace adjusted her scarf as she walked hand in hand with Leo toward the shelter. Daniel walked beside them, carrying a brand-new umbrella still wrapped in brown paper. The sight of families gathered inside made her heart swell elderly. Mrs. Chen sharing cookies with the Johnston kids, Mr. Peterson reading the evening paper while his dog dozed at his feet. "Look, Mommy," Leo pointed excitedly at the book exchange box. "Someone left my favorite bus book." "That's wonderful, my Joe," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "Maybe we can read it while we wait." Daniel unwrapped the umbrella, a sturdy black one with a curved wooden handle, just like the one Grace had given him that rainy morning that changed everything. He turned it over in his hands, a soft smile playing at his lips. "This feels right, doesn't it?" he said quietly to Grace. "Coming full circle?" She nodded, watching as he hung the umbrella carefully on one of the empty pegs they'd installed along the shelter's wall. Each peg had a small brass plaque beneath it that read, "Take if needed, return if possible." Leo tugged at Daniel's sleeve. "Can I tell them the umbrella story, please?" "How about we let the umbrella tell its own story?" Daniel suggested, ruffling Leo's hair. "Sometimes the best gifts are the ones that find people when they need them most." The shelter door slid open, letting in a gust of cold air and a woman clutching a worn duffel bag. Her clothes were thin for the weather, and exhaustion lined her face. She hesitated at the threshold, clearly unsure of her welcome. Without hesitation, Grace and Daniel shifted on the heated bench, making space. Leo immediately scooted over, patting the empty spot. "You can sit here, it's warm." The woman's eyes grew damp as she sank gratefully onto the bench. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been walking for hours." "Here," Grace said, reaching for the cocoa supplies. "Let's get you something warm to drink." As she prepared the hot chocolate, she watched Daniel quietly point out the umbrella to the woman, explaining that it was there for anyone who needed it. The woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, some of the wariness leaving her face, as Leo cheerfully showed her his favorite pictures in the bus book. Through the shelter's windows, other lights twinkled in the distance. More shelters, more beacons of hope spreading across Chicago's neighborhoods. Each one had its own character, its own community caretakers, its own stories of small kindnesses multiplying. Some had mini libraries focused on children's books, others featured artwork from local students, and still others hosted weekly storytelling hours for seniors and kids. The Umbrella Fund had grown beyond their wildest dreams, but its heart remained simple. Create spaces where strangers could become neighbors, where dignity was freely given, where no one had to weather life's storms alone. Mrs. Chen offered her cookies around the shelter, and soon conversation flowed easily among the gathered people. The weary traveler began to share bits of her story. She was heading to her sister's place, looking for a fresh start. Immediately, Mavis, who had just arrived with more cocoa supplies, began connecting her with local resources and job opportunities. Leo leaned against Grace's side, his eyes heavy with contentment. "I like our bus family," he murmured. Grace wrapped her arm around him, meeting Daniel's gaze over their son's head. In his eyes, she saw the same gratitude she felt for second chances, for everyday miracles, for the mysterious ways love could transform a simple bus stop into holy ground. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the shelter, warmth and laughter created their own kind of light. A bus approached, its headlights cutting through the twilight. Some of their shelter companions would board it. Others would wait for the next one, but all of them were part of this lovely, ongoing story of community. The traveler stood as the bus pulled up, reaching for the umbrella with tears in her eyes. "I'll bring it back," she promised. "Or pass it forward," Grace said softly, remembering her own words from so long ago. "That's how hope grows." Daniel squeezed her hand as they watched the woman board the bus, the umbrella clutched close like a talisman. Leo waved enthusiastically until the bus disappeared into the snowy evening. Around them, the shelter glowed with warmth and welcome, ready to gather in the next person who needed a moment of grace. Through the windows, similar lights dotted the cityscape, a constellation of shelters, each one a testament to the power of one small act of kindness rippling outward. Their laughter joined the gentle murmur of conversation filling the shelter, a song of belonging rising into the winter night. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Grace Delgado, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.